Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So I am a permaculture designer. I live on a 7-acre homestead, about an hour north of New Orleans, and I'm in the 7, 8, 9 zone. I have a YouTube channel called The Riley Retreat where I talk about permaculture, and I got my certification in 2016 in Asheville, North Carolina. So oh man, I wish I could see everyone at the same time as I'm doing this, but let me see if I'm able to do that. No, I don't think I'll really be able to see y'all. Okay, well, just speak up if you have a question. And I'm totally open for questions afterwards too. So my intention with this conversation is to give you a big picture overview on composting and take us all the way down to the soil. And I want to frame this conversation through the lens of permaculture. So permaculture, if you haven't heard of it, started in Australia, and it was a shortening of the words permanent agriculture, but it's come to be known as permanent culture. And basically, it's a design system that is mimicking nature. So it's using the observation of what we see out on the land and what naturally occurs, and working with those functions. For example, my home, it can come in any form. It can come in gardening, home structures, placements of trees. So for my home, I have trees on the south side, and that allows shade in the summer, but they're deciduous trees, so the leaves fall and allows heat in the winter. A very famous concept is the permaculture chicken, and it performs multiple functions or stacks functions. So it can make enough manure to create an entire cubic yard of compost just from leaves. It'll go through and eradicate any pests in your garden, fertilize all over, and just great entertainment in general. So Leonardo da Vinci said, "We know more about the movement of the celestial bodies than about the soil under our feet." And as Steve touched on, food is the single largest category of material sent to municipal solid waste landfills. From a big picture point of view, we also have to take into account compost's ability to store carbon in the soil. And carbon is one of the leading issues in climate change. So composting is about creating an environment where bacteria can outgrow each other. So for example, in the loamy and wrinkle tools, they're basically heating up and creating bacteria and fungus. They're creating an environment for those microorganisms to flourish. Which takes us to those microorganisms, the soil food web. So the food web, we like to hear food chains, right? The bird eats the insect, and the cat eats the bird, and the coyote eats the cat, and so on. Sorry, I'm not trying to be morbid, but it's not truly like that. In fact, food chains are more like webs. They're linear. So this bird might eat this arthropod, but it also might eat the worm. But the worm might eat the protozoa and the bacteria, and so on. So it's a very interlocked chain. It's a food web. So this is what happens when we look under a microscope at the soil. So if we just take a little, zoom out a little bit, we can think of the soil as the Earth's skin. And this food web is the biome that protects the health. So we have a microbiome on our skin that, and within us, that determines the health of our immune system. And it's the same with our soil. So there's a lot of different microscopic players at work. We have bacteria and fungus, and they break down the chemicals in food. And then protozoas and nematodes, which are like worms, those are breaking down the food itself. When all these creatures are in balance, there's an abundance of health in the soil. And we can think of this like forest. No one has to go into the forest to water or fertilize or spray pesticides or insecticides. It is a naturally occurring healthy ecosystem, and it's because of this soil. So if we think about a tree, whenever winter comes, which is coming right now, and fall, it starts to lose its leaves. All those leaves fall on the ground like a blanket, and they compost. They break down and they feed the soil, and all those creatures, the microorganisms, eat the soil, eat the leaves, and they have a lifespan. They live and die, and they become the carbon in the soil. And the more of that goes on, the more nutrients in the soil, the more the soil can store water, and just the healthier in general. So this is the Johnny Appleseed version of composting is where I'm going with this. So if we just take a look at this illustration, we see the food on top, and then bacteria and fungus, those first level consumers, the nematodes, the worms, and as we go down, it's the more microscopic versions, drawn bigger, larger. And this is what a compost pile food web looks like. Very similar thing is occurring naturally in the soil outside of compost. But these are the creatures that do the conversion from food waste to soil. So these are the real heroes in composting. I touched on these facts, but what's fascinating about this is that I don't know if anyone has been able to stick their hand in a pile of hot compost, but it's steaming hot. In fact, there's people that run brass wires through compost and like a hose, a brass hose, and they can put the water through the compost pile and have a hot shower in the middle of summer because it can get so hot. And what is getting that pile hot is these microorganisms. They're breaking down that matter, releasing gases, and it's these little buddies here doing all the hard work. You can see this is a healthy, ready-to-use compost because it looks like fine coffee. So when we look at what kind of compost recipe, what does it take to really get a good compost? It's going to take about four ingredients. We have our greens, our nitrogen, and that's about 70% of the pile, and then our brown carbon. It also needs water and air, which is why we turn it and water it. So a compost pile can get up to 150 degrees, and this is the USDA regulation to get it to between 131 and 150 for 3 days. And this is when our seeds die, any weed seeds, any pathogens, and it breaks down the materials very fast. It's pretty amazing to watch a pile as tall as me break down to only a foot off the ground. Here's a few other graphs of things that fall under the carbon and nitrogen list. I included this on the right because it's not entirely true. In large operations, things like cow carcasses can be completely composted in a matter of weeks. Animal feces, if you are going to put this compost on food, then that is true. You want to avoid that. Otherwise, though, any of these other things, if you get the ingredients, the ratios right, you can add these things. It's just when you're doing a smaller compost pile on a home scale, these things tend to make it a little more challenging to get the ratio correct. And then besides our normal Johnny Appleseed compost pile, there's some other adventures that you can explore. Worm composting, compost teas, compost toilets. And this is such a broad topic that I can barely scratch the surface.